If you were a medieval knight, what weapon would be your first choice? I think the knight's sword would be the answer for most people. Greetings, esteemed sir. I am your loyal friend and advisor, Shinbai. I've heard you have just been knighted. I have been ordered to open the armory for you to choose a suitable sidearm. Here, I will first introduce you to the knight's sword's origin and classification. For your reference, if this is helpful to you, please do not hesitate to praise it, and gift me 2 coins representing treasure and profit. The types of swords in the Middle Ages were diverse. Long swords, short swords, one-handed swords, hand-and-a-half swords, two-handed swords, and so on, were all in use. Choosing without understanding them first will likely lead you into confusion. However, the most typical among them is definitely the knightly sword, or arming sword, or knightly arming sword. This is a straight weapon with a crossguard and a pommel, usually double-edged, and used with one hand. The blade length of a knightly sword is mostly between 70 to 90 centimeters. Of course, there are also some longer or shorter styles. The knightly sword, starting from around the 11th century, was widely used by warriors in many European countries. It is said that its cruciform appearance also holds a certain Christian symbolism. This type of sword likely evolved from the Viking swords of the 8th–10th centuries. And the Viking sword likely evolved from the Roman eras. Straight sword that replaced the Roman gladius. The Spatha. The Spatha was influenced by Celtic and Germanic swords. Sometimes the Viking sword itself is also considered a type of Spatha. During the early medieval Merovingian era, in the Frankish and Alemannic regions, there was also a popular type of sword with no distinct pommel and a crossguard as wide as the blade, known as the gold-hilted sword. Another type with a ring-shaped pommel, the ring sword, also appeared during the same period. Of course, none of them were as renowned as the Viking sword. Many people may not know that the Viking sword, which became famous due to the Vikings' campaigns, is actually more accurately called the Carolingian sword. It originated in the Frankish Empire during the Carolingian era. At that time, the Frankish sword-making technology was far ahead in Europe. But later excavations of this type of sword mostly appeared in Viking-age Scandinavian burial sites. Because starting from the 8th century, the Franks no longer had the custom of using swords as burial goods. The number unearthed on the European continent is relatively small, while the Vikings, through weapon exchange, trade, raiding, and ransom, acquired many Carolingian swords. High-status Viking warriors all liked to wear this type of sword. Therefore, people later conveniently called them Viking swords. In the mid-9th century, in order to restrict the Norse people from possessing this kind of high-quality weapon, the Frankish kingdom once enacted a law prohibiting the sale of weapons and armor to foreigners. In the year 860 for AD, the king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, made this crime punishable by death. But this could not reduce the Norsemen's enthusiasm for this type of sword. Trade decreased, so raiding naturally increased. The Viking sword is a typical one-handed sword. Its average length is shorter than the later knightly sword. The crossguard is narrower, and the grip is relatively short. The length of a Viking sword is generally between 73 to 100 centimeters, with most being around 90 centimeters. Very few exceed 1 meter. The blade length is between 70 to 80 centimeters. For example, the Sebe sword unearthed from a tomb in Sebe has a total length of 95 centimeters and a blade length of 78 centimeters. The longest and heaviest surviving Viking sword was unearthed in Fla, Norway, It has a total length of 100.4 centimeters, a blade length of 86 centimeters, and a total weight of 1.9 kilograms. It is housed in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. The Fla sword has a large pommel. It can be considered a giant among Viking swords, but its balance is poor, making it not easy to use. A major feature of the Viking sword is the design of the pommel. At the end of its hilt, it is generally composed of 3 to 5 arc-shaped lobes, somewhat resembling clouds or mushrooms. Contrary to what many might imagine, a considerable number of Viking swords were single-edged. A scholar took 110 samples from 1,700 Viking swords unearthed in Norway. Among them, 40 were double-edged, 67 were single-edged, and the remaining 3 could not be determined. The Viking sword is the essence of Carolingian-era swordmaking. Craftsmanship. The production cost was very high. Therefore, owning a sword was a symbol of power and glory. During the reign of Charlemagne, a Carolingian sword with a scabbard was worth 7 solidi. At that time, the price of 1 cow was 1 to 3 solidi. Only cavalrymen could afford this type of sword. The Icelandic sagas mention that a Viking sword was worth the equivalent of 16 dairy cows. High-status Viking. Warriors all had their own Viking swords. The swords of the Jarls were especially ornate. Many were wound with gold and silver wire, or inlaid with various decorative patterns. As for the common farmers, they mostly used spears and one-handed axes. They formed shield walls and spear formations. And under the leadership of those wielding Viking swords, they campaigned throughout Europe. Around the 10th century AD, the establishment of the Duchy of Normandy led to the Normans gradually becoming more active. At this time, the Norman sword appeared, a transitional form from the Viking sword to the knightly sword. Compared to the Viking sword, the Norman sword's length was closer to the knightly sword of the mid to late Middle Ages. The blade length could reach 90 centimeters. Additionally, its crossguard was widened, became slightly thinner, and was cruciform in shape. The blade also became more tapered. It was the most important melee weapon of the Normans, mainly used by knights, and as a family heirloom, was passed down through generations of Norman nobility. Norman knights usually swung their swords downwards, using powerful, heavy blows to break the enemy's shield or chainmail. They generally only used thrusts when finishing off defeated enemies. Starting in the 11th century, the typical medieval knightly sword began to be popular in Western Europe. The later scholar and collector Ewart Oakeshott classified European swords from the 11th to 16th centuries into 13 different types based on their forms. These are types X to 22. The main criteria for differentiation are the sword's cross-section, length, fuller characteristics, and taper. The length of the grip and the shape of the pommel are not absolute criteria for classification. Most of these swords have the typical features of a knightly sword, or have slight adjustments to some components. Although Oakeshott also classified the crossguards of knightly swords into 12 styles, but the overall cruciform layout was the absolute mainstream among them. Wider than the Viking swords, thinner, straight crossguards were also commonly used. Some also used curved or upturned crossguards, while the shapes of pommels were even more diverse and often better reflected the preferences and personality of the maker or the sword's owner. If it were you, what kind of pommel would you choose? If you disassemble a knightly sword from the end to the tip, it can be mainly divided into the following parts: pommel, grip, crossguard, ricasso, and blade. And on the blade, there is the fuller. The form of a knightly sword has a certain correlation with the era it was active in, but it's not absolute. Many early forms continued to be used in later periods. Among them, types X to 12 were mainly active in the 11th–12th centuries. Type X is actually the Norman sword, which is a transitional type. It is narrower and longer than the Viking sword, with a more pronounced taper. The cross-section is wide and flat, and the fuller runs almost the entire length of the blade. The blade length is around 80 centimeters on average. The crossguard width is 18 to 20 centimeters on average. The grip is relatively short, similar to the Viking sword, with an average length of 9 centimeters. This Norman sword, discovered in a German region, is inscribed with the famous name Ingilry. It is a very typical Type X. Its blade length is 77.7 centimeters. The grip is rather short, and the pommel has some features of the Viking sword. Type G is more slender than its predecessor, with a more pronounced taper and a narrower fuller, but the form of this sword is still suitable for cutting from horseback rather than thrusting. It also has a shorter, wider variant, Type Gia. The biggest change in Type 12 is the shortened fuller, extending to about 2/3 of the blade. Its taper is more pronounced, enhancing its thrusting performance. The grip length is about 11 centimeters. The longer, heavier variant, Type XIIA, was introduced to counter improved chainmail. Type 13 is the typical crusader's sword. Popular in the 13th century, it can be considered the most classic knightly sword. Its characteristics are a grip lengthened to about 15 centimeters, a rounded or spatulate tip, a lenticular blade cross-section, and a further shortened fuller. This sword is generally for one-handed use, but can occasionally be used with two hands. It can be understood as an early form of what is often called the hand-and-a-half sword. For example, this 13th century crusader sword, with a blade length of 78.7 centimeters, is a very typical Type 13 form. The subtype of Type 13 is XIIA. It already has the form of a two-handed greatsword. The grip can be 17 to 23 centimeters long, and many have a blade length of over 100 centimeters. The Type 14 sword has a short, wide blade with a very strong taper. The upper part is almost triangular. The grip is short and flat. The crossguard is generally long and curved upwards. The blade of a Type 15 is even closer to a triangle, with a strong taper. Its cross-section is diamond-shaped, with no fuller. It heavily emphasizes enhanced thrusting capability. Its appearance was likely a response to the use of plate armor. The grip of this sword type is also quite long, so it can also be classified as a hand-and-a-half sword, convenient for both one- and two-handed use. Type 16 is also a hand-and-a-half sword. It is similar to a slender Type 14, with a strong taper at the end of the blade, balancing both cutting and thrusting. Type the 17th, which appeared around 1360 to 1420, is a heavy sword. Some can exceed 2 kilograms, suitable for dealing with heavily armored enemies. Its blade cross-section is hexagonal. It has a strong taper and is also well suited for thrusting. It is generally held with two hands. Type 18 appeared in the late Middle Ages. It has a short grip and a diamond-shaped blade cross-section. Its taper is strong, but not overly pronounced. It is also a sword suitable for thrusting. This type has several strange variants, including some two-handed sword styles. You can look into them. Type 19 appeared around the 15th century. It is relatively slender, with a hexagonal blade cross-section and a narrow fuller. The taper is weak. The blade length ranges from over 60 centimeters to over 80 centimeters. The most obvious feature is that many blades of this type have Arabic inscriptions at the base. Some later versions also have a finger ring on the crossguard. Type 20 appeared around the 15th century. It is a hand-and-a-half or two-handed sword. A major feature is its double fullers, or a mix of single and double fullers. Its blade edges are generally parallel, with some taper at the tip. Its subtype, XXA, mainly features an enhanced taper. The characteristics of the fuller are still very distinct. Type 21 appeared around the second half of the 15th century. It has a relatively wide blade, a very strong overall taper, and 2 or even more fullers, running the entire length of the blade. It also has a slightly curved crossguard. This should also be a sword geared towards thrusting. Finally, appearing from the mid-15th to the 16th century, is Type 22. It has 2 very fine, short fullers. The blade is wide and flat. This is an ornately decorated sword, relatively short overall, and is generally considered a ceremonial sword rather than one for combat. Faced with so many types of swords, you are probably dazzled, given that your enemies have gradually started to adopt plate armor. Components. I suggest you choose the Type 16 Handanda half sword, which balances both cutting and thrusting. You can choose the shape of the pommel you like. Of course, don't forget to give your sword a name. I believe you will be very willing to share that name with us. I wish you a fine sword that suits you well. See you on the battlefield.